This is Peter Helland with David Wemhoff, and Dave just wrote an article. Today is 26th. He wrote it on Christmas Day, and it has to do with trying to bring back the confessional state, which he brought forth at a pro-life meeting about 8 years ago, and he was violently rejected with this idea. But now, all of a sudden, people are warming up to this idea. So, Dave, it looks like some people might be listening to you now on this thought. Can you? I don't think anybody, normal person, has never even heard of this thing. Okay.
No. Well, about 11 years ago, I gave a talk at National Right to Life. It was July of 2008, and I'd been asked to talk at National Right to Life convention every year for like 5 or 6 years in a row. And so they asked me to talk again in July of 2008. National Right to Life Committee is the preeminent pro-life organization in the United States. They work primarily for legislation and other things to end abortion and also to end euthanasia and other things that threaten life within a very narrow category. And so I had been there talking for 5, 6 years in a row. I gave my talk, and in my talk I said that you've got abortion and other ills in society because society is based on error. And you need to base society, American society needs to be based fundamentally on a new system. And that new system is the divine positive law or the Catholic religion. And so when I finished the talk, a lot of people applauded. There were 2 Catholic priests in the audience. They just got out of their chairs. And I mean, they just came out of their chairs just clapping wildly. I'll never forget that. And they came up, they talked to me later. They were really impressed. Now, some of the leadership of the National Right to Life Committee were there, and I looked over at them, and they were looking down, and they were signaling, and they were very clearly nonplussed by what I had said. And they were not smiling, they were not clapping. And after that, I knew it was over with at that point. I knew they were never going to ask me back. I knew I was cut off, and I was. They never asked me back. They never called me. I called, I said, hey, we're going to do something in 2009. Never got a response. Didn't even have the courtesy of returning my call. So that's what we dealt with there. And then, on the local scene, you come back and you try to talk to people about the Catholic Confessional State and reordering society. And you try to talk to the pro-lifers because you figure that they would be the ones most involved in that, because they're basically arguing against Roe versus Wade. And their whole position, really, whether they want to admit it or not, is that they want to base American laws and jurisprudence on religion. That's what they want to do. And if they say otherwise, then you have to ask them, well, then what is it that you're basing the laws on? What's your objection then to Roe versus Wade? So they basically want to base the laws and jurisprudence on some form of religion that outlaws abortion. So I try to talk to these people about that and try to raise awareness of that, saying, hey, we need to work for the changing of society and making it a Catholic country. We need to make America a Catholic country, and we need to work like Archbishop John Hughes said in 1850, we need to convert the Americans. And I was just shut down for all these people. I got nasty emails. They said, no, you need to just focus on pro-life. I was sat down and told, it was really something by a prominent person who who is here in town, and one of his friends, and they sat down one morning after breakfast, and they said, we need to talk to you. And I said, what? They said, the Catholic Confessional State is not practical. And they just looked at me. I said, well, that's what you're called to do. I said, if you don't do that, I said, you're going to have all the evils that you rail against. If you don't work for the conversion of the Americans, you're going to have all the evils that you rail against.
Can you just detail a little bit the Catholic Confessional State? Because I don't think the average person's never even...
They've never heard of it, and they think it's a theocratic union, and it's not. The Catholic Confessional State is a state where the government recognizes the Catholic religion as the basis of the policies. So that means, you don't have abortion, contraception, and other things. Those are the most prominent examples.
But before America in 1776, and then the Constitution, 1787, every country had some type of confessional state, right?
That's correct. That is correct. And most of the colonies, not all the colonies, except for Rhode Island, actually had a state-established church. They were very much aware of this idea, and they utilized it. And they were Protestant churches, and Protestants are heretics. So you're dealing with something that is really not perfect and is capable to manipulation. To a large degree, because they don't have the international structure and they also don't have the truth. So they're kind of feeling their way, and they're subject to more control by outside forces. But still, that's what you had in the colonies. And they did in Virginia. The established church did slap down Thomas Jefferson, and that upset him quite a bit. It left a big mark on him. But what we have now, I feel vindicated, because in the last 9 months, you're seeing an increasing call with the Catholic Confessional State. Right before I came here tonight, I received a couple of emails from a friend of mine in Canada, and he says that an open letter was written to the bishops of Canada, asking the bishops of Canada to please start teaching the faith, that they want the return of the Catholic Confessional State. Because Canada, especially Quebec, it was Quebec mostly, was really the government, the administrative organs were under the control of the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church really, up until about the mid-1960s, had control over the bureaucracies and the policies. And it was a very Catholic society, large families, people were taken care of, a lot of peace. You didn't have abortion, you didn't have contraception, you didn't have any of this stuff. This is the stuff that should sing to Catholics. When I talk about the Catholic Confessional State, you're going to have a situation where abortion isn't allowed, and contraception isn't allowed, and euthanasia isn't allowed. And the pro-lifers should hearken to that. And they should say, oh my gosh, yes, that's a great idea. But they don't. They don't.
Aren't they going back to like Bishop Hughes? I mean, when the Catholics came over here, and they really didn't get any power until around the time of the Civil War, I think, is when they started immigrating in. But there was a couple guys that were strong that held that position, that, we are fighting for the Catholic Confessional State. But most of them decided that strategy wasn't going to work, and they went into a simulation.
They realized it wasn't practical.
Right. They said
this is kind of dangerous, and yeah. I can be somebody. And the guy who was most notable for that was Cardinal Gibbons, the guy who founded Catholic University of America. He was the guy who really understood that if I play the game, I can sit at the table with the big boys, with the rich people. But, if I start talking about Catholic Confessional State, if I start talking about converting you people to Catholicism, well, you're going to kick me out to the curb. And he was of Irish descent, and by gosh, he didn't want to have to live a hard life like that. But there were a lot of Irish that were for the Catholic Confessional State.
But a true Catholic had to make that position, right?
Well, you had to do it. And
or you're denying your own faith.
You're denying your own faith. And what makes it most egregious with Gibbons, what makes it most egregious with Gibbons is that he was writing his own catechism and leaving out the teachings of Pius IX, which was the Syllabus of Error that came out in 1864. So Gibbons was writing his catechism in 1876, 1877, and he was praising the First Amendment.
Isn't that interesting? Pius IX was the one that was in correspondence with Jefferson Davis.
Pius IX was in correspondence with Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and he hand wove a crown of thorns. If you go to New Orleans, it's in the Museum of the Confederacy, or right, it was.
I checked into that.
Has that been removed now?
No,
that's not politically correct anymore?
I was mistaken by that. That was it was Jefferson's wife, Verena, that weaved it.
Well, I remember seeing the crown of thorns, and I remember
they deceptively labeled it because the Pope did send him a picture of himself with the phrase "Take up your cross and follow me." And the crown of thorns from further research that I did, that was his Jefferson Davis's wife Verena.
Well, because
I weaved it.
Because I remember reading it, said this was from Pius IX.
But not the crown of thorns.
I think it was. I
will have people check it out.
But we'll check that out. But I remember reading the little sticker. But if you go through Richmond, where the presidential mansion was for the Confederacy, for Jeff Davis, if you go up in their rooms, you'll see paintings from the Vatican. I mean, very, very clearly religious paintings
Yeah, well, what was happening is that Lincoln was losing the war, so some people thought, and he didn't have any generals, they told him the best general was Garibaldi, okay, and who was living in New York City for a while. But Garibaldi also was the big general taking down the Papal State, okay. So Pope Pius IX was enemies with Garibaldi, Mazzini, and here's the North wanting Garibaldi to be their general. So the Northerners were siding with the main enemies of the Pope, the Marxists, basically.
Well, so and what we've seen this year is an incredible turnaround by Catholic intellectuals and and people who have got the ability to influence the public, and you're starting to see some of them calling for the Catholic Confessional State. One of them was Sohrab Ahmari. He's Iranian, and his name's a little difficult for me. Sohrab Ahmari. He's an editor of the New York Post, and or a contributor to the New York Post, and he's a trained lawyer. He's from Iran. He immigrated here to get away from the Ayatollah, I believe it was, when he was 13 years old. His parents, he admits, were Bohemian, very Bohemian, but they were Iranian. So he came over here. He converted to Catholicism. He, along with, I believe it's Michael Schmitz of First Things, an editor, who just recently converted to Catholicism too, put together a manifesto in March of 2019. Now, the manifesto does mention a papal writing, and it does call for certain things that are rather anodyne. It says, we need to focus on the home, and we need to focus on faith, and we need to focus on the American citizen, and we oppose this international globalism. I think that it's called the Against the Dead consensus, and it's a manifesto. I think it leaves a lot to be desired. I think it fails on many fronts because it provides what some people would consider not a real identity, just somebody who's opposed to the globalists. So it's kind of like you're an anti-abortion versus abortion. So right away, you've got a losing proposition. Plus, they planted this thing, this manifesto, in the conservative political camp, and they're saying the old conservative alliance between the social conservatives and the economic liberals or libertarians is at an end, and so now we're post fusion. We've broken apart. We want the combination of concern for the worker and concern for the social issues to come together. Well, okay, fine. But it's very vague and it's very general. And I think what you have to do when you're dealing with the Catholic Confessional State is you've got to talk about you want the Catholic Confessional State. That's what they're doing in Canada. There was somebody right before I came here sent an email. In the email were a couple of links. I watched the links. This woman, Faith Goldy, has got a video show, and she talked about a letter that was written by a number of Catholics to their bishops in Quebec and said, we want the Catholic Confessional State. Bring it back. Teach us the faith. Do your job, okay? And that's really what has to happen. The Catholic leadership, the priests and the prelates have got to do their job. But in any event, even though we have this manifesto from March of this year, Sohrab Ahmari is also got into a debate with David French. So there's a real fight going, and David French is a writer for the National Review, and he's also a lawyer, a constitutional lawyer, and he's an evangelical. And there's this fight going on in the conservative camp politically. But I think what's most important was what NPR did on December 7th. On the Media is a show that's done by New York Public Radio, and in it they interviewed a Matthew Sitman, who is one of the associate editors of Commonweal magazine, and he said there's the right is becoming illiberal, the conservatives are becoming illiberal, and he says part of the reason is because you're dealing with Catholic integralists, people who want to see church and state doctrine working together. In other words, the laws are going to be based on the divine positive law. He's talking about the confessional state. That means there are Catholics out there who have got some influence who are saying we need to reorder America to be along the lines of the Catholic confessional state.
But they're coming up against, I think it was Lawrence versus Texas decision.
There was Lawrence versus Texas was the 2003 decision where the Supreme Court removed any doubt that if you think that the laws of America are going to be based on a religion or a moral code based on a religion, guess what? That's unconstitutional. You can't do it. All you can do, all the government in the United States can do, whether it's state, local, or national, is listen to religious people, voice their concerns, nod politely, ask them if to take a seat and give them some water, and then say, thank you, we'll get back to you, and then decide whatever works from a practical point of view, which is going to be ultimately to maximize the wealth, the 1% and those. So that's what you're dealing with. You got National Public Radio that's starting to say, hey, Armani is a Catholic, and he's saying we need to get to the confessional state. We need to build society so it serves the highest good, capital H, capital G. Well, what does that mean? That means salvation, right? That means that you have to have society build virtue. Okay, so then things like abortion, contraception, pornography would all be outlawed. That's not free speech under a Catholic Confessional State.
People have always had a sense of that, because that case that where they got fired for having the Bible, and we took it to the Supreme Court.
Right.
But the conflict was Indiana law says you have to go to school. Kids have to go to school. Of course, there is homeschooling, but most of the time people didn't even know about homeschooling. So people always thought we have to go to school because the Indiana Constitution says that the people have to be moral and upright. So it says, purpose of school is to encourage by all suitable means moral improvement.
Yeah, but how do you define moral improvement?
Right. But then the problem is you have to go there for that, but then you find it's illegal to try to all what you think is a suitable means to promote it is illegal. So it's at a juggernaut, and
right, because what is if you're going to talk morality, it's going to be based on some theistic religion. Well,
no one's going to agree.
You can't do it. It's against the law.
Right. So you have to go to school.
Constitution.
Right, but that highlights that people know we can't survive if everybody's a criminal.
Well, people are understanding that it's getting too far. I think the gender identity stuff is starting to push people over the edge. I think the vast concentration of wealth is starting to push people over the edge, and they're starting to say there's got to be a better way. And then you got Sohrab Ahmari, a convert, a guy who writes for the New York Post. Holy cow! Who gets his editorials published in the Wall Street Journal.
He's only 34 years old.
He's only 34 years old, and he's talking about the highest good. Society should be oriented towards the highest good. This is really pretty radical stuff, and you'll never hear the bishops talk that way. You'll never hear priests talk that way. But what you're seeing is this thing is coming to a point in people's minds where something's got to be done.
Because you can't have this bifurcation. I mean, you have the laws that Congress passes, but they can't be passed based on religion or divine positive law.
Right.
Well, it's freaking people's heads out, because you go to church and learn one thing, and then you go to the court and you learn another thing.
Well, it's something else. And so there's that cognitive dissonance that you're talking about. But, it really became pretty obvious. The other day, I was in Mass, and it's like, it's funny. It's not really funny, but it's really very enlightening, actually. I don't mean that in the enlightenment sense of the term, but became very apparent to me that despite all the efforts of all the enemies of Christ, to include mostly the priests and the bishops, and I think even the Pope right now is really opposed to Christ and his teachings. They attack Catholicism in so many ways. Even despite these guys' efforts, Christ is still there. His truth is still there. If nobody believes in it, it's still the truth. It's still there. And it keeps coming back, and they keep fighting it. They keep fighting it all they can with everything they got. The enemies of Christ keep fighting it and fighting it. Tom Woods recently had something on his podcast where he was talking to David Hall, who was a professor, and David Hall is an evangelical, and the evangelicals, are just big supporters of America, and the evangelical position is really opposed to the Catholic position, because the Catholic position, I'm talking about Catholicism, I'm not talking about the church teachings, which indicates individuals or church leadership, I'm talking about Catholicism. Catholicism condemns this system of social organization, and that was done very clearly with Pius IX. But the evangelicals support it. And what I have found, like David French is an evangelical, and he's a lawyer. Bill Kristol wanted to get him to run against Trump in 2016, but David French said no. David French is also a writer for the National Review, and he's an evangelical Christian, and he's a big supporter of the American system of social organization. Then, you have this Dr. Hall, who's an evangelical. He's a big supporter of the American system of social organization. Tom Woods is a big Catholic. He's got a big Catholic following. He doesn't necessarily follow Catholicism himself, but he interviews Dr. Hall because Dr. Hall is there, having written a book about is America a Christian? Was it based on Christian principles? Were the founders Christian? Were the founders Christian? So right away then, right away in your mind, what it is, oh yes, well of course. They were, because if they're Christian, then America's Christian, and we can support it, and it's good. And so that was the whole psyops that Woods and Dr. Hall were involved in. But what's interesting, I think, is that evangelical Christianity is largely individualistic. I mean, they have their mega churches, but you can come and go as you want. But as I mentioned in my article, there's this young Harvard doctoral student called Eric Nordby, who's doing this research. I don't think the paper's out yet, but he's doing some incredible research about the Great Awakening in the 1730s. And that's really kind of important. And I'm looking at that in my next book here that I'm writing on America, which has taken a while, but it needs to be done. But the Great Awakening was in the 1730s, and what it did was an attack on the established churches. We talked about the established churches in the colonies. Well, this was an attack on them. You had this Great Awakening where the Holy Spirit is just going to raise us all up individually to do the right thing. And this has persisted throughout American history. And what that does is it fractures society. So we're all just a bunch of individuals, and we're just feeling self-righteous, and we're making, most importantly, we're making decisions, and most important of those decisions are what? Economic decisions by ourselves, without any kind of preconceptions or any kind of teachings that may restrict us. So we focus on the individual. And the reality is you don't get economies of scale with the individuals, okay? You actually can sell a lot more and get more economic activity with individuals broken apart.
Well, a lot of that was, George Whitefield was the main preacher for the American Awakening, Jonathan Edwards. But Whitefield started preaching. He was with Wesley in the Oxford Club, okay? And they would read the Greek text. They would do all this, and Whitefield was the lowest. He was like their servant. But at 21, he feels called to preach. And he goes out and preaches all over.
What made him qualified to preach?
That's my
because
point.
The Holy Spirit, right? And see, this is what was condemned and Testem Benevolentiae by Leo XIII when he condemned when he condemned Americanism. It was 1899, January 22nd. The encyclical came out. He condemned Americanism. He said this idea of the Holy Spirit telling individuals to do the right thing, and that's right. That's bunk. This idea, he said in that encyclical letter, he said this idea of writing and saying whatever you want is disastrous. It's bad. I mean, right there in the Americanism, encyclical or apostolic letter, you've got a condemnation of the First Amendment. Yeah, every time you read that, you see something new. You understand more and more what he was talking about. Because you had a society where you had religious liberty, which allows the Holy Spirit to just come into everybody, however they think, and do whatever they want. You don't need institutional churches. So you break any sort of ties to other people.
See, the old thought
and was, so you're easier to have stuff sold to you, which means it's good for finance.
The old thought was, like Jesus said, I say nothing but what my Father tells me to say. And then you had Anselm saying, I wish to say nothing what Augustine says, except what he said. And so there was always this, this very submissive attitude that you wouldn't dare say something that contradicted the church fathers that went before you. You were super careful. And if you did, you did it with great trepidation.
And it kept a continuity with your forebears, with your forefathers, who oftentimes looked a lot like you because they came from the same part of Europe. So it kept that type of continuity, okay? And that's very important. But see, the Great Awakening started to break that apart. So it's pretty easy for the individualist Declaration of Independence, which is very individualist, and the Constitution, very individualist.
Well, Whitfield would stay at
To come
Benjamin,
along.
He would stay at Benjamin Franklin's house.
Right, and
what
build
I heard.
upon that. And build upon that, right. Because you want individuals. They're easier to sell stuff to. Okay? They're easier to work with economically. And America was in a situation where it had a frontier, and they need individualists to go out there and do their thing.
Well, without the Great Awakening, they might not have been able to do the revolution. And the reason is that they were too divided. And with Whitfield and the preachers, they all had a common message. Because he preached to half of the Americans. I mean, he was preaching all over. And so all of a sudden, there's a connection. They're all hearing the same thing.
But it's individualistic.
Oh, yeah.
It's a very individualistic message. You do your own thing.
Well, it was shallow. It was evangelistic. It was
evangelical. This is what you have now.
It was a shallow
and so now
message.
they're going out onto the frontier as individuals. That's what you got to have. You know, you need brave guys to go out there and sacrifice their life and make economic decisions, and that has stayed with America since then. This decentralized making of economic decisions, which we know today as consumerism. Okay? We buy whatever we want, whatever we can, because we're totally divorced from our forebears.
Mm-hmm.
Totally cut off from them. And part of the way you cut them off is cut them off with religion.
Well, you look at the church services. I mean, if you had the old timers come back from 100 years ago or 400 years ago, and they would observe the church services with the drums, and they're halfway a rock and roll concert. I mean, that's how they would see it. Is that where'd this come from? There's no continuity with how they used to do a service. I mean, I'm just talking Protestant. But even the Catholic is...
Well, the Catholics, every Mass is a high Mass. I mean, every Mass you sing, and nobody sings. Nobody wants to sing. Maybe they'll sing the Christmas carols, but a lot of the songs are songs you've never heard before, and they're always changing them. And it's just really raucous after a while. It's just a cacophony of sounds that is just very, very unsettling. It does not help you get in the right frame of mind. But it cuts you off from those who came before. I mean, I remember the songs that I sang as a kid. My dad sang the same ones, you know, but now it's all cut off. The kids now, they sing totally different songs. But once again, you're just broken off, which is the whole idea of the whole intergenerational thing, like the greatest generation, the baby boomers, the Gen X, the millennials, the Gen Z, the Gen Y, whatever. This is how they break you apart, and they create markets, okay? This is ridiculous. When people start thinking in that term, they have been completely cut off from their forebears. The fact of the matter is that you and I are descended from people who were from Europe. And that sense of identity is shattered when you have to go and say, well, you're a baby boomer. Oh, you're a Gen Xer. Oh, you're a millennial. Completely shatters that identity. Completely shatters it. And the reality is, in America, there is the rising of new ethnicities and new groups. You know, you got African Americans, you've got, you know, white Americans in the North, white Americans in the South. You know, these are different groups. These are different groups that are rising, that are present, that have an identity, okay? And that's the reality. But the fact of the matter is that people now are calling for the Catholic Confessional State. And that's what they want. And it's starting to bubble up into the consciousness because that is a system of people, priests and bishops who, you know, once again, they have to be purified, they have to be corrected because we got a lot of pollution in the church. These are people who are sitting there who make decisions not for money, but for the welfare of society.
But the Catholic Confessional State, I don't see it. Before America, you had Catholic confessional states, and you usually had a king. Now we're in a republic. Where is an example of a republic having a Catholic confessional state?
Hungary.
Okay.
Hungary. Viktor Orban, he just recently said at the end of November, he said the only way to save Europe is to return to Christianity. That's a confessional state. The Catholic Church is protected in law. What did the Pope say in response? Nothing. Nothing. He said nothing. There's no support, no nothing from the Vatican. You know? That's my finest Hoosier accent. No nothing. You know, nothing from the Vatican. You're nothing. It's because the Catholic Church leadership is in bed with the Americans and the universal individualists and the liberals. And that's what they want to advance. They want to continue. So what has happened in the past when there was corruption in the church, strong secular leaders would generally rise up.
Like and Franco, you mean?
Franco was one.
Okay.
The emperors during the Holy Roman Empire, Henry I, the Fowler, Otto I, all the way up to Saint Henry II and his wife, Saint Cunegundis. they basically took over the church in their areas. They appointed the bishop, they appointed the priest. And they wanted people who were going to do the right thing by their people. And so then eventually the church reformed itself. Plus you had Cluny and you had the other monasteries that grew up that purified the church.
But isn't that how people see Trump? Isn't that all that are backing Trump? They see him as this, not necessarily a Christian leader as far as his behavior, but they don't really care because he's appointing conservative judges. He picked Pence, and he's doing this. I mean, isn't that why?
Well, a lot of people like Trump for a lot of reasons. The evangelicals are split. The churchmen are all split. And this is what Pete Buttigieg is about. He's there to break apart the churches. He's there to get a religious left. And so what you got, and we've spoken about this before, is you got this government official telling you what church doctrine is. That's unheard of. In the 1570s, the Queen of England was excommunicated. And the Pope commissioned an armada from Philip II to go depose her. And the Jesuits went in there to depose her. But nowadays, you get this little pipsqueak telling you what your religious doctrines are, and everybody's silent. Just give some money to Catholic schools. Okay. That's where we are.
Do you see any leader rising up?
No, I mean, I think you got guys like Viktor Orban that are strong. I think you've got some people in Poland, but I don't know if they fully understand what they're dealing with. I think that you've got the nationalist movements in a lot of European countries that, they may not be perfect in the eyes of some people, but they're at least a resurgence of the natural law, of a group of people who are alike. And there's nothing wrong with people who are alike to exist and to advance. There's nothing wrong with that. And to stay, and to grow their populations and to protect themselves. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the natural law. That's something the Catholic Church has taught from day. That's Catholicism.
Well, until America, what you have St. Pat's, St. Hedwig, Our Lady of Hungary.
Right.
Those were all Catholic Church connected to a specific ethnicity.
Right.
And it was maintained for a while
That's
in this
right.
country, but it couldn't maintain itself for very long because of the way we're structured.
That's right. Because America encourages, with the First Amendment, America encourages religious liberty, which means you can do whatever you want, religious-wise, and the sole determiner of good and bad in America is success. And usually that's denominated in dollars.
Right, and of course I bring it up all the time, but until the Civil War you had the states with their state churches. Of course they got rid of them, but some of them, Massachusetts I think had their state church even up till about 1836.
Yeah, I think most of them were gone by the 1840s, if not all of them.
But their constitution still had a lot of references to God, and so you had at least a sense in the states.
Massachusetts Constitution.
All of them. Indiana has references to God all the time.
It has a reference to God, right.
But so all the states could...
How do you define God when you're different religions, or different viewpoints?
True, but it seemed to give them some balance. But with Lincoln winning the war, the federal Constitution now had a lot more authority after that war.
Oh, there's no doubt about that.
Okay.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that.
And the federal Constitution, the thing that's unique about it, there is no reference to God.
No, there's no reference to God. You sent me some material a while back about an effort in 1864 to put Jesus Christ in the Constitution.
In the North.
In the North, that's right. And there have been 18 attempts to get a constitutional amendment put in place. 18 attempts, 1-8, to get a constitutional amendment put in place to recognize Jesus Christ as God in America.
And that all laws had to be in some way or fashion consistent with his teaching.
Well, sure. That is the assumption. 18 attempts. 18 attempts. The last one was in 1969. Every single one. How many of them succeeded?
They all failed. Because
everyone failed. Every single one failed.
Even though the first ones, I think they had a big one. They met in Pittsburgh. You had a Supreme Court justice. You had governors, presidents, a huge list. And not all of them, but a lot of them said that the Civil War itself was not so much because of God's wrath on slavery. It was God's wrath on the failure to acknowledge God in our laws, in our Constitution. They felt that was the main reason for the Civil War.
Well,
these guys were no lightweights. We can't even comprehend such thinking.
Well, but now what you got is you got Mr. Amari, an Iranian convert to Catholicism, a guy who writes editorials for the Wall Street Journal and writes for the New York Post. He's saying,
and he's young.
We need the highest good, capital H, capital G. That's what society is supposed to do. That's what we need to do. Now, they've got this consensus manifesto from March of this year from First Things, which I think fell short in a lot of ways, and they just can't pull their punches. But there's starting to become an awakening here that you need Catholicism running the society. So the Catholic Confessional State is not looking so impractical anymore.
Well, I remember in the briefs that went to the Supreme Court, the other side, I had them cornered, really. And they would say, well, there should be some kind of morality. We kind of agree with them on that. Yeah. In other words, no moral principles guiding the culture. I mean, with no authority, nobody in authority.
Well, the culture is guided by the powerful private interests, people you don't even know. They control the culture because they're protected in the First Amendment.
Well, partly because everybody's going along with the game, and the game is the definition of success is money, or the pursuit of happiness is best achieved by the accumulation of wealth.
It's material success is what they're talking about.
Right.
Fame, fortune, but everything can be given a monetary value.
Yeah, so when your mom is at the bridge club and your dad is over here and you're talking how are your children doing, and one goes, yeah, he's doing really well, he's pretty successful. Well, what does that usually mean?
Well, it means they're getting the eye of the rich and powerful, and they're moving up, and they're getting the accolades of a lot of people. They're making more money, and that's what it means.
And then the church kind of stays silent when this is being done. They don't protest that definition. They don't protest
are you kidding?
Success.
They built St. Pius X Church in Granger, not far from where I live, and it cost them more than $20 million. They want successful people in there because they need the money to pay off the debt. And it's a beautiful church, but a lot of people probably don't understand all of the figures and significance of everything that's in there.
Well, people go to Notre Dame, and there's this cognitive dissonance because these two truths, they contradict each other, and you can't believe in two things that contradict. But yeah, you can. You can fake it.
But Catholic integralism says, and all the popes said this, is that a citizen should not be subjected to conflicting demands from the church and from the government. They can't be.
They're super weak, like they are in these other countries.
That's where the civil leaders have got to step up.
But if the people are corrupt, you can't.
That's the history.
Get blood out of a turnip. I mean,
that's the history of the church. The civil leaders step up. But I think what